Before I get started, I got to tell you, I had the weirdest dream this morning. When I was waking up, I dreamed that I was in some contest to write a Broadway musical, and I kept up until the last minute. It was due today, and up until the last minute, I was just working on the words, and I completely forgot to do anything about the music. So I think that's a warning to you. You're getting a lot of content today, but not so much art. So today we're starting a new sermon series called Who is Jesus? And as we approach the Holy Week and Easter, the cross and resurrection, we're going to ask one important, simple, powerful question. Who is Jesus? It's a simple question, but it's one that we sometimes lose sight of, isn't it? If we don't circle back to it often enough, we might end up believing what a lot of people seem to believe, that Jesus, he's really just like me. You know, stars, they're just like us. Jesus, he's just like me. Or we'll believe that Jesus is just like our community. Jim said last week, God made us in God's image, and we've been trying to return the favor ever since. But that's not the way that it works. See, Jesus doesn't change. We do, but Jesus doesn't. Our world changes, but Jesus doesn't. And when the world changes, we have to meet Jesus again for the first time, which is why over the next 5 weeks, we're going to ask this all-important question, who is Jesus, to just one gospel, the Gospel of John. Why? Well, if you've studied the Bible before, you've probably noticed that the Gospel of John is really different from the other three Gospels. So different that sometimes we wonder, is this the same Jesus that we find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Why is the way that he speaks in John so different from the way he speaks in the other Gospels? If you've studied John before, you probably also know that the Gospel of John was written nearly 60 years after the other Gospels, which might make you question how reliable it is. But those two big reasons are a big part of why we're studying John now and why we should study it more. You see, one reason that the gospel wasn't written down and circulated until 60 years after the other three was that it didn't need to be. You see, John's community, John's church, which you might hear us call the Johannine community sometimes if we want to show off, it most likely lived a set-apart life after the resurrection. And their spiritual leader was John, the beloved disciple, and likely one other important person we'll get to in a few more weeks. You see, they didn't need a written down gospel because they had something better. They had a witness. Not just one of Jesus' disciples, but the one who got Jesus in a different way than any other did. You see, John understood that all the correct theology in the world didn't make a difference if you didn't love like Jesus. So that was the rule for their community. They loved one another. And if they had a question, they could look to the Bible they had, the law and the prophets, or they could ask someone who knew Jesus better than anyone. But leaders get old and die. And before John did, probably with some help from the many disciples he made over those many years, his community did write it all down. I mean, isn't that kind of refreshing? Can you imagine if our community was that unhurried? If our world allowed that kind of intentionality? If it wasn't such a rush to be first, to get it right now? See, that's how we actually get to know who Jesus is. That's the kind of outlook that we need, especially now. So with that in mind, look, we're going to do this for the next 5 weeks. Let's go to God in prayer. Would you pray with me? God, I ask that you would bless our time in John's gospel, that you would show us who Jesus is and how he brings us to you. Amen. So, who is Jesus? The first and most important thing that John says in answer to that question is that Jesus is God. Not a God, not God-like, but God. To show us that, John's gospel starts in the boldest way it possibly could. It's in your bulletin thing if you want to underline or mark it up. But it starts like this. It starts in the beginning. What other book of the Bible begins that way? Yeah. It's kind of bold, right? The very beginning of the Bible is repeated here. The Gospel of John links itself to Genesis and insists on its place in the Scriptures. It's a truth that took 60 years of communing together to be able to put so concisely. So it starts, in the beginning was the Word. Now, the Greek word for word is logos, which is where we get the word logic. It's connected to wisdom and reason and all kinds of important philosophical things. You can make a lot of hay from this word in Greek if you want to, and a lot of people have. But in every translation of the Bible that I know of, they always render it as word. Never any of those other things. And they're right, and here's why I think that is. You might not know this about me. I like to mispronounce words. Never names, though. So if I ever mispronounce your name, please correct me. But if I can think of a way to say any word wrong and still be understood, I'll do it. For instance, I prefer to get my burritos from Chipotle. I think it's more fun to park a car in a garage. Partly because it's fun, and partly because if I happen to be feeling a little ornery or grumpy, which happens every now and then, and someone happens to correct my pronunciation of a word that isn't someone's name, I've got a reply all ready to go. I like to say, okay, but did you know what I meant? Did the miracle of language still take place? Did the neurons in your brain make a picture that mirrored the neurons in mine because of the sounds I made with my mouth? Did it still work? I mean, words are little miracles, aren't they? We have this flesh and all these gross things in our mouth. Terrible breath from coffee. But still, we make these sounds, and you know what's in my mind. It's a miracle. They allow our invisible thoughts to fly instantly from inside one brain and into another. See, when we're communicating, I don't want to know your words. I want to know your thoughts. I want to know your beliefs. And sometimes there's something going on in my mind that I desperately want to share with you, but I just can't find the right word. And if I can't find the right words until I do, and then I find it, that feeling of relief and resolution, oh my gosh, it's great. That's what Jesus is to God. He is the perfect word that conveys the thoughts in the mind of God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Dale Bruner, who preached here a long time ago, wrote a very heavy commentary on John. Not heavy in that it's hard to understand. It's just really big. And he writes that the word used for the usual English translation with is not one of the two major Greek words for with, but the more intimate toward, which is difficult to render in English. Toward. The word was toward God. We don't have a word for that. Another professor rendered it, and the word was in God's presence. And another, the word was very close to God. Or my favorites, the word was in God's home. Or the word was face to face with God. You see, our words, as miraculous as they are, they're still just inanimate, not objects, but I can't think of the right word. You see how important they are? But Jesus is a different kind of word. He's the word that is face to face with God and is God. A self-expression so complete that he becomes, he always is another person. Which is exactly what the next verse tells us with its pronoun. Verse 2, he was in the beginning with God. This word is not an it, but a person. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. You see, Jesus isn't less than God. Do you hear that? The Word, which for the rest of John will be known as the Son, is not a creation of God. God created through the Son, through the Word. God is a community of equal persons. All of creation came into being through them both. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. You see, people are what it's all about for God. According to the Bible, human beings are the pinnacle of creation. You have to believe it on faith. Stars and planets, flowers and dolphins, none of them have anything on us. It is for the people that the Word came, as we'll see in verse 14. He gave us life, and that original life was full of light until we corrupted it. But even so, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Dale Bruner sees the cross and resurrection here in this verse, and I think he's right. The cross is that light shining in the darkness. The resurrection is the light not being overcome by death and pain and sin. So when we ask just these first 5 verses of the Gospel of John, our question, who is Jesus? Just look at the answers we get. That Jesus is no less than God. That he has been in a communion relationship with God the Father since before there was time. And even here, if you know where to look, you see that the cross and resurrection was the intention behind creation. And we get all of these truths from a group of people much like ours, except for this one way. They were in no hurry to produce any great works, but they were content for generations to live in contemplation and in community with this great truth that they had experienced. Verse 6. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light so that all might believe through him. Now, this in the beginning stuff right here gets really nitty-gritty. We were out at the beginning of time, in the inner life of the triune God, at the edge of the cosmos with life and light. And then in one of the greatest focus pulls of all time, it zooms all the way to the earth, and then filling up the frame is this guy named John. When you go from timeless truths to particularities, it can be a little jarring. But that's the way it works. If it didn't get particular, it wouldn't be real. In this place, it got real with a man named John. Here's John. He lives here. Well, if you really think about it, with two men named John. You see, John, not the Baptist, never put his own name into this gospel. Wouldn't allow his own name to be put into the gospel. He's only referred to as the disciple Jesus loved, which is a worthy identity goal for all of us. But I can't help but wonder, along with scholars who are actually qualified to do so, if this verse wasn't left vague enough by the final editors of the gospel to include their spiritual father's name in the text in a way that he couldn't make them remove. So the next verse is just as true about John the Baptist as it was about John the disciple. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light which enlightens everyone was coming into the world. All right, now I want to skip past the next 4 verses, if you're following along, and I want to come back to them at the end, because verse 14 just can't wait any longer. It's most likely the reason this gospel was written when it was, and it's the most radical truth in all of our faith. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. The Message translates this as the Word became flesh and moved into the neighborhood. And we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. You see, the second thing that John wants us to know about Jesus is that Jesus is a human being. Not just like a man, but a real flesh and blood human being. Jesus was fully God and fully human. Not halvesies, not 70-30, not God on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and human on Tuesdays and Thursdays with an alternating schedule for the weekends. Jesus was 100% God and 100% human. And getting this fact straight may have been why the gospel was written when it was, and not even later. Because you see, at the end of the first century, a new doctrine concerning Christ was getting popular in Asia Minor. It claimed that Jesus was not really human, that he just looked like a man, that his body was of no importance. This belief is called Gnosticism, and it became for some the basis for like a kind of fake mystical life, cut off from human realities, from the human body and from human suffering. And it's a belief that's never really gone away. It just changed forms. We have our own struggle against people in the church and outside of it who discount the truth of our being flesh and blood, in part by denying science and promoting ideas and cures that are nothing more than body-denying magical thinking, and in part by shrugging their shoulders at the suffering of others. Sometimes they spiritualize it, and sometimes it's just apathy, but for Christians, it should all stop immediately at John 1:14. The Word became flesh. You see, this is the arena of God's action. This is where it all happens. This life is not a flight from the world of pain and of matter, but a mission into it, to love people as Jesus loves them. See, Jesus is God, and Jesus is human. If we actually internalize the implications of those two truths, we would be downright fascinating as people. And here's just one way. You see, God became material. The all-holy God personally joined our world of sin and suffering to save it. But think about the implications of this. I mean, we know for a demonstrable fact that our flesh is a part of the evolutionary network of life on this planet, which in turn is a part of the solar system, which came into being as a part of this long cosmic history. The evidence in the cosmos points to the idea that everything that exists came into being in a single instant, 13.7 billion years ago. That's when the universe exploded into being from a single solitary speck. Let there be light. Yada, yada, yada. The first stars died around 5 billion years ago, and some of them exploded into supernovas, which cooked basic hydrogen into more complex elements. Some of that material reformed and reignited to become our sun, a second-generation star. Some formed into chunks that were too small to catch fire, and they formed the planets of our solar system, including ours. Then 3.5 billion years ago, on this planet, some of those molecules that were hydrogen once and got turned into something else, they coalesced to form living cells. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. Over millions of years, out of the life and death and in between reproduction of single-celled creatures, there came trilobites and fish and amphibians and insects and flowers and birds and reptiles and mammals, and among them emerged human beings. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. British scientist and theologian Arthur Peacock explains that every atom of iron in our blood would not be there if it had not been produced in some galactic explosion billions of years ago and eventually condensed to form the iron in the crust of the earth from which we have emerged. Does everyone else have goosebumps right now? The human flesh that the Word became is a part of the vast body of the universe. The implications of this are deeper and wider than even John and his community recognized. The genetic structure of Jesus' cells made him a part of the whole community of life that he initiated. This material world then becomes a sacrament that contains God's presence. Back to verse 10. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. That's not just a risk for them then, but for us now. We can miss Jesus, not only by missing Jesus, but by discounting the world that he made and became a part of. This is not just, a rabbi from ancient Palestine that we follow. This is the eternal, older than 13.7 billion years old universe that he spoke into existence. The eternal God who created it all with the intention of joining it, not just for a while, but for the rest of eternity. Like him and like his disciple John and the community that he started, it's it's more than okay to not always be in a rush. Think about those billions of years. Think about the 30 years that Jesus just hung around being God. Think about the 60 years that John's community took to write the gospel. It's okay to not always be in a rush. In fact, being unhurried, being intentional, and working together is what we just heard it means. Part of what it means to be made in the image of God. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God. So who's Jesus? Jesus is God. Jesus is human. And Jesus did it all so that we, you and me, might become human too. Not human like we've been, but human like he is. Truly human. I want us to embody two of these principles today. I have two things I want you to think about as we end. Two words that come to mind based on what we've just heard. First is unhurried. The second is intentional. Two ways to truly be human. We'll get back to it next week.